Welcome to the Texas Nerd House, y'all, where we are about to explore the wide world of arcade game ROM hacking. Now, this whole series of videos was derived from a 90-minute talk I gave to a group back in April. But for YouTube, it has been sliced into several chunks, and we've also added some enhancements for better consumption. Now, why would people go around hacking arcade game ROMs in the first place? I mean, there's not personal information or government secrets on them. However, by hacking arcade game ROMs, you can change the graphics that appear in the game, you can add language translations, you can fix bugs, and you can also manipulate the game rules and the game scoring. Now, there's a lot of nuances involved with hacking arcade game ROMs, from knowing the tools and the tool sets available to you and working with those well, to having a good understanding of digital logic design and computer hardware. Now, I'm going to take my degrees and my years of experience in this field and distill them down using animations and diagrams for you, so that you don't have to earn that embossed piece of parchment paper just to do the things that you want to get done. Now, in this first video, we're going to go over tools and techniques for how to make that very first hack for a platform that's never been hacked before. How do you use MAME to figure out exactly what you need to hack? And frankly, what are the other tools that are involved in this process as well? Now, in the next video, we're going to talk about exactly how you make those changes that you want to do. And then in subsequent videos, we have even more topics to cover. So please subscribe to us if you haven't done that yet. Stay tuned for our future videos in this series, and let's get to talking. Basically, what we're going to be going through tonight is a series of thought processes that you can implement to go around and look inside of an arcade ROM to figure out where the graphics are, figure out how the gameplay goes, figure out how to modify things and just cause a bunch of problems and cause a bunch of fun, and make something definitely different that nobody's ever seen before. We both have big backgrounds in computer engineering, computer science, and so for both of us, it's pretty easy to kind of dig in and look at these things. But for those of you that are maybe less technical, a bit more on the artistic side of things, just want to focus on that rather than the tech, we definitely have some stuff later on that's more tool focused that you can use to just dive in and edit some stuff right away without having to worry about all this logic and reasoning and stuff that it might not be obvious without staring at patterns for a long, long time. So without any further ado, let's go on. All right, so I started out back in 2016 by modifying the Tapper game, which is pretty cool. I like playing the Tapper game a lot. It's got the Budweiser logo in the back and all kinds of other Bud branding in it. But there's a brewery called Community in Dallas. And Community is actually at a spot where I hosted an event one time where we were doing some recruiting, and I thought it'd be really cool to bring in an event where we would play Tapper, but with community branding, and also on a gigantic NES controller. So we had an NES controller that was 100 times the size of the actual NES controller that you'd hold in your hand. This thing was a tabletop. You could put drinks on it. Everything was lacquered, and so it was all nice and strong. So you're playing Tapper off this really big, ridiculous thing, and it was made for a cool setup for people to come and interact with. So in the process of trying to get the community logo on Tapper, I had to first figure out how the Tapper game was working so that I could change it. So tools that you need to have on hand in order to modify the Tapper game. First off, very important, you need the MAME emulator. Of course, MAME is an engine where you can sit and load up a whole bunch of ROMs for a whole bunch of different systems, not just arcade systems, but a lot of the home consoles as well, or even obscure things that you've never even heard of. Basically, it's like a little computer emulator to run anything you can possibly imagine. It's also, you're going to need game ROMs. Now, a couple of ways to get those. You could find an old arcade game, pluck the ROMs out, put them in a ROM reader, download them, or you can just go on the internet and find them just the same way. You need some hex editors. So a hex editor is something that doesn't just show you the text files, the contents of a text file in text per se, but it actually shows you the binary representation of how the computer interprets that file. And then as the computer interprets that file through something like a text editor or a bitmap editor or something like that, then it shows you the representation to expect. But in order to understand what the computer is seeing, you need a hex editor. And my favorite one particularly is called Hexplorer. Hexplorer is nice because it's got kind of a matrix style color scheme to it. It's got the black background, and it's got various shades of green that are basically proportional to the magnitude of the number you're looking at. So low numbers, dark green, high numbers, light green. Really convenient. Then you can use GIMP, which is basically like the free open source version of Photoshop for new graphics creation. And that's the part that we'll be talking about later on towards the end. And then also pre-built tools for the game's platform. And I'll tell you about some of these pre-built tools that exist and some places on how to get them. But if you don't have pre-built tools or can't find them, then gee, I sure hope you can write code, because the coding is going to make your life a lot easier. If you try to do these edits by hand, you're going to be sitting here for years, probably, scratching your head on like dumb little mistakes that'll happen. So to get right into the MAME emulator, obviously download MAME, unzip it, and then put your ROM into the ROMs folder in its own directory. So off of MAME, you got ROMs. Then say if you download a Tapper, make a directory called Tapper and put all the binary files inside of that folder. Then launch MAME and use the command line. So why should we use the command line? Well, as it turns out, if there's an invalid checksum with your ROM compared to what MAME actually thinks is right, because the hexadecimal numbers that make up each byte in your ROM file get added up into a hash. And if this hash doesn't match what MAME UI knows to be the correct hash for your game, then it'll cause an error. Well, you don't want MAME bothering you that your ROM is wrong. So as it turns out, when you go through and load it through the command line console, then MAME lets you continue when there's a ROM checksum mismatch. And it'll basically let you go through and run your creation. So a couple of the other options on here, you got -- windowed, -- window makes MAME windowed rather than full screen. Otherwise, you might have problems navigating to their applications. You might not be able to go Alt Tab into, or Command Tab into some other text editor or something else that you wanted to open up. It might also obscure some of the other debug windows you got open that you wanted to look at. So you still want to have window there. Otherwise, it takes up your full screen. You can't get to anything else. There's Nomax, which makes your window very small. You can still resize it at will, but Nomax also makes even more room available for other applications that you want to look at the same time. And verbose is there's an option to spew lots of other information on the command line window, such as a CRC checksum with ROMs, input and sound devices being loaded, status of initializing the ROMs, and so forth. Now, debug, that flag, -debug, is going to launch the debugger. And you can kind of get a glimpse of that down at the bottom, where you can see the highlighted line of code that's currently running on the emulator. And so then there's a couple of keyboard shortcuts that are useful. You can press F5 to run in debug mode. That actually starts the execution of the ROM when you're in debug mode. Then you can press F4 on the actual game window to set up the tile viewer, and then enter for more information. You can also go forth hitting enter to scroll through several screens, and you can hit essentially the left square bracket and right square bracket to iterate through the different colors if you're looking at color palettes or looking at tiles that relate to color palettes. So definitely useful to learn some of the stuff around MAME. Now, once you have your ROM files, well, what do you actually do with any of these files? So there's a couple of ways to figure out what these things are doing so you know exactly which one you want to jump into. So for one, you can get your bearings using what I like to call the visual flight rules. It's a little bit, it's a hacky and flimsy and a lot of wibbly wobbly guess and check kind of stuff, but it's the first way that I ever learned how to do this. So what you can do is look at the tile viewer in MAME. Remember, hit F4, and this will show you the available color palettes, the tile artwork, and the tile map that's used throughout the whole game. Not just the stuff that's on screen now, but throughout the entire game. Now, if you try to find out the background files, and you see all these luckily are named, although the ROMs are named in some organized fashions, like tap BG0. Well, it sounds a lot like background. And also tap FG. Well, it sounds an awful lot like foreground. Okay, PG, program. Sure, that's all plausible kind of stuff. But, if you're still trying to test your assertions, you might want to go into tab BG0 with your hex editor, that is your hex explorer. And you might compare it with the patterns that you see in the tile viewer. So as you look at the tile viewer first up in Tapper, you're going to find a lot of square, just blobs of color. The tile is completely a solid color. And then eventually you'll find some stuff like stripes or patterns. And then eventually you find some of the actual assets that are involved, like the curvature of the little bow tie and the Budweiser logo or stuff like that. Or you might find the hat of the guy that's actually, the beer tap operator or something like that. So eventually, as you kind of start slowly, you'll see where in the hexadecimal side of things, these patterns change. You can start to correlate that with what you're seeing on screen. And then if things look like they're relatively the same, obviously the tiles that are not changing should be pretty consistent in what the hex looks like. So you'll see just long strings of the same character being repeated over and over and over again. And that's probably when you know that you're in the money. Here's a tile. It's got the same color throughout. Here's a series of hexadecimal that all looks the same. So now that you've found the spot in the hexadecimal code, we'll start making some edits to it. What's the harm in overwriting some of these things with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0, blah, blah, blah. So once you do that, start to practice making edits and then see if the results are what you expected. And then refine and tweak these things if it didn't meet your expectations. So let's go on and talk about now, instead of the wibbly wobbly guess and check way, here's the IFR way, the instrument flight rules. This is the fancy stuff. This is what you pay big money for. So let's say that the Tapper game, for instance, instead of having BG, PG, and FG like you have on the right, let's just say it's Tapper 1 through 20. Now you got no idea which ROM is doing what. Okay, this is going to be a lot of hassle to open them all up and to do the technique that I just described. So what you can do instead is browse MAME source code on GitHub. There's a link for it right there. You can search in the repository for the game name as you enter it in MAME. So Tapper, of course, would just be Tapper. You can search for Tapper inside of the GitHub and look out for it in the code. You want to look for a result that's a CPP file, that is a C++ file, in the source drivers folder. Now, further on, you can look for a section in the file called ROM start. And this basically defines a series of memory addresses that are relevant to the regions in memory that these ROMs get loaded into. And you can also see, in essence, what section of memory you're looking at as well. So you can see through the comment that there's 64K for code. You can see there's 64K for the audio CPU. And eventually, you'll see stuff for the graphics as well. There might be a ROM region for GFX or GFX0 or something along those lines. So, and of course, the keyboard shortcuts will help you as you're actually in MAME doing the work to try to find the tiles.
Okay, now you've gotten acquainted with helpful tools for beginning to reverse engineer a game ROM, and a couple methods for finding out exactly which ROM to edit in order to make the desired changes. In our next video, I'll demonstrate the technical process of modifying the ROM in order to observe changes in the graphics and discover exactly how graphics are encoded in the game. Our third and subsequent videos will cover yet more topics, so please be sure to subscribe and hit the bell if you want to be notified when we post the next video in this tutorial. Bye, y'all!